Welcome to the AI Policy Podcast, a podcast by the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at CSIS. I'm Gregory C. Allen.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz.
Join us as we dive into the world of AI policy, where we'll discuss the implications of this transformative technology for national security, geopolitics, and global governance.
Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. In this episode, we're going to discuss what AI policy might look like after the U.S. presidential election. We're going to dive into the past, present, and future, both the Trump and Harris campaigns' AI policy positions and where they fall on the key issues. To get into all of this, as always, I'm joined by my co-host on this podcast, Gregory C. Allen, the CSIS director of the Wadhwani Center. Greg, let's get into it here. Before we look at Vice President Harris and President Trump's respective campaigns' AI policy positions, let's discuss what the Biden-Harris administration's done in the last 3.5 years when it comes to AI and the state of AI regulation under the previous Trump administration. So let me just start by saying, what have been the current administration's biggest AI policy efforts?
So I think the biggest one, starts with the executive order. And this administration had a big executive order on artificial intelligence. It's titled the Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Executive Order. That came out in October 2023. We're actually still dealing with the repercussions of that. The 270-day milestone when a bunch of deadlines hit just happened. That executive order was a big deal, and it's continuing to move. Now, I think what's interesting is that AI really hit its stride in terms of a technology capturing the public's imagination in October 2022. And there have been so many different downstream consequences of that. It's become wrapped up in almost every different policy issue. An AI and elections integrity. There's an AI in misinformation. There's an AI and child exploitation, AI and national security, AI and economic growth, on and on and on. Basically every single aspect of the American government. If you're the director of any U.S. government agency, it's totally fair game for somebody to ask you a question, what are you doing about in terms of AI? And the Biden administration has had a few big moves. The first, in national security, they've launched a host of initiatives to try and accelerate the adoption of AI in the national security community. So you have the Replicator initiative by the DoD, which is all about AI-enabled autonomous drones. You also have the recent Collaborative Combat Aircraft program, which a plug to a paper we've got coming out here pretty soon. That's like a tenfold increase in the DoD's budget for AI-enabled autonomous fighter drones. And so that's big on the national security side. Then on the regulatory side, Biden administration participated in and led a few efforts. The first was voluntary commitments, and this is one where Vice President Harris was very much in the driver's seat. In fact, some of the reporting and some of the claims by Biden administration officials, it was her idea to convene leaders from some of the biggest AI companies in the world, Microsoft, Google, Anthropic, OpenAI, others, and bring them down to Washington, D.C., have a meeting at the White House, and at the end of that were voluntary commitments. So not binding regulations, but basically saying, hey, we all agree that this is a good practice when it comes to being safe, secure, and trustworthy, and that was a Harris-led initiative.
The Times report the other day about her and AI was really timely for us for this podcast, but also as the world's trying to learn what she's been doing the last several years. It's a really good indication on AI, isn't it?
Vice President Harris has actually been a genuine leader in the Biden administration's AI work. A lot of the stuff flows up to her. And this is, common for folks who don't spend a ton of time, thinking about what it's like to run a White House. It's very common for a vice president to have point on a few issues. And it happens to be the case that Vice President Harris, a former senator from California, where an awful lot of tech industry resides, really was the point person for a good chunk of the administration's AI policy. She also attended the UK AI Safety Summit, which was a very high-profile international discussion around AI safety, led to the creation of the UK AI Safety Institute, led to the creation of the US AI Safety Institute, a new institution housed in the Department of Commerce. So she was representing the administration there. And as I said, somebody deeply enmeshed in the AI policy community, nobody was confused, right, when it was Vice President Harris who was representing the administration. She had been deeply involved in these efforts the whole time.
Let's look back at the Trump administration approach to AI regulation. During their years in office, how did they approach it?
One thing to remember here is that we often say in Washington, D.C., people are a policy. Who you pick in critical appointments, that is the level of the decision, right? Because usually the president's not going to be in the weeds on every single policy issue. So picking who your person is, who is going to be in the weeds, really matters a lot. Well, there was actually carryover. There wasn't a ton of carryover from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. But one of the areas where there was carryover was in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where Dr. Lynn Parker had served running a lot of AI policy initiatives in the Trump administration, and she continued on working in the Biden administration. And that's because she was a civil servant, first and foremost. She was not a political appointee by the Trump administration, and she was working on stuff that really had bipartisan support. Stuff like improving standards for AI risk management. This was an initiative that was born out of the Trump administration executive order. So directed the Department of Commerce, directed the National Institute of Standards and Technology to come up with standards for AI governance and risk mitigation. And then that culminated in the AI risk management framework that actually came out during the Biden administration. So it's like these are efforts where there actually was, some common ground. And of course, utilizing AI for national security and defense, that's also a big point of common ground. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration really view competition with China in AI and national security as really foundational to the overall geopolitical competition and national security competition between the United States and China. And so that's one of the reasons why when we had Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer come visit CSIS in June of 2023, he had a bipartisan initiative in Capitol Hill around AI. There wasn't a ton of areas that were very bipartisan, but AI policy was one of those areas. And I think there's some things that you can point to in what the first Trump administration did that also emphasize, what parts of this are bipartisan.
So little known that this is actually a bipartisan issue of sorts in Washington.
Potentially, you're using the wrong tense there. Was a bipartisan issue, So it might be that the tides are changing. We'll get into that, but there's one other thing that I think is really worth highlighting that the Trump administration put out. One of the things that happened late in the Trump administration, so in November 17, 2020, there was a memorandum that came out as guidance for the regulation of artificial intelligence applications. This came out from the Office of Management and Budget, which is a really important agency that often sort of lingers in the background. And the memo was authored by Russell Vought, who was at the time the director of OMB. That document really talks about what they want from AI regulation. And the sort of summary of it, which actually comes out in a different thing, the American Artificial Intelligence Initiative one-year report. This is the sort of super abridged, discussion about what they want. But they said that they wanted to ensure public engagement, make sure that regulations were developed in partnership with industry and academic experts. And they also wanted to promote trustworthy AI, which I think everybody sort of understands is a worthwhile goal. But then there was this other one called limit regulatory overreach. And here I'm just going to read the full quote. Regulators must carefully assess risk and the costs and benefits before considering regulations related to the development and deployment of AI applications, with a focus on establishing flexible, performance-based frameworks rather than one-size-fits-all regulation. The principles also direct the federal agencies to reduce duplicative efforts and ensure consistency government-wide. Now, in terms of what the political conversation looks like, what the campaign argument around AI looks like. I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but I think it's fair to say that the Trump campaign is criticizing the Biden administration when it comes to AI as being too prone to regulate AI. The reality, however, is that what the executive order can do on AI regulation is in some ways pretty modest, at least when we're talking binding regulation, thou shalts, right, that are enforced with fines or jail time. There's just not a ton that the executive branch can do by itself without Congress. And so I think the Biden administration would say with a very straight face, we did limit regulatory overreach. Most of our stuff is in voluntary standards too. Most of our stuff involved public engagement. And so it's one of those areas where argument and the attacks make you think that the gulf between the two sides is perhaps bigger than it really is.
All right, well, let's drill down into the Harris campaign and Trump campaign AI policy proposals. Starting out, in the run-up to the RNC convention earlier this month, the GOP adopted an official new party platform laying the groundwork for what AI policy might look like under a second Trump administration. While Vice President Harris's campaign in the early days, she's played a leading role in AI policy, as you mentioned, at the White House. So starting with the Trump campaign, what specific AI policy positions does the official party platform outline?
Well, I think there's two things that are worth pointing out here. Number one, there's been reporting on this topic that says, compared to other presidential candidates, compared to President Trump during his first presidential campaign, who's sort of deeply personally involved in this particular Republican Party platform. If you read it, there's a lot of language that you can recognize in the way Trump speaks and the way Trump writes. His personal touch, you can kind of believe it. But who's the other critical individual in this story? Well, you would assume it is the policy director of the Republican National Committee Platform Committee. And who's that individual? It's Russell Vaught, the exact same person I was just talking about.
Guy from OMB who is working on the Trump era AI policy.
Exactly. Two reasons to take the Republican Party platform seriously, when it talks about AI policy. What does the platform actually say? There's only one section that explicitly addresses artificial intelligence, and then there's some other sections that I think sort of, if you read between the lines, are relevant to artificial intelligence. So the first one, the section that's called artificial intelligence, says that a second Trump administration would, quote, repeal Joe Biden's dangerous executive order that hinders AI innovation and imposes radical left-wing ideas on the development of this technology. I've talked to folks who are close to the AI policy circles that might, be a part of a second Trump administration. And everybody says that you should really take this platform document at its word. The executive order would be repealed, right? Potentially on day one, if the Trump administration, wins this election and it becomes the second Trump administration. There's one thing there that I think is worth calling out, though, which is there's a lot of different ways to repeal an executive order. Let me just give one example in terms of how the Trump administration has behaved in a different technological domain. So the Obama administration in 2010 had a document called the United States Commercial Space Policy. I want to say it was like a 10-page doc. In 2017, the Trump administration issued its own. I think it was called the Space Policy Directive. And literally, it changed one paragraph of the commercial space policy. So it said, delete this, add this, and now it's not the Obama, space policy anymore. Now it's the Trump space policy. But they didn't actually change that much. Other things that the Obama administration did, every single line was repealed. And so when the Trump administration says that they're going to repeal the executive order, that's unambiguously true. But then how much are they going to bring back in whatever replaces that executive order? And that we don't really know. It's tough to say. There's some things that you can point to in terms of what Republican AI policy circles are talking about. But anybody who says they know for a fact, what would happen, I think is sort of overstating the amount of information that's available, at least at this stage.
All right. So, Greg, what can you tell us about what Vice President Harris and her campaign have said about AI so far since she's been the presumptive nominee?
Well, she hasn't been the presumptive nominee terribly long.
No.
But in terms of what we can say, what she has said so far, I think she's endorsing the Biden administration's approach, kind of unsurprisingly, right? Because she really had an important role in that. There is already a Democratic Party platform document. It dates from July 13th. So technically, this is the Biden-Harris era platform. Of course, she would presumably endorse all of that. It had a section called Seizing the Promise and Managing the Risks of AI. And I think that really does stand as a justification for what the Biden administration thinks that they have done. There was calls to slow down the development of AI. There was a very famous letter that was circulated in, I think, early 2023 that talked about a 6-month pause on all AI research around the world, right? The Biden administration never endorsed that. The Biden administration never said slow down. The Biden administration said that as we continue to press forward, and in fact, in this case, press forward means accelerate forward, we're also going to need some additional government capacity in things like AI safety, AI risk mitigation. Basically, government needs expertise. It needs folks who know how to look under the hood of these machines and who can actually say, when things are going to go well. As I said, the Biden administration executive order is criticized as a heavily regulatory document, with the exception of the government regulating it itself, regulating its own behavior for things like privacy, civil liberties, et cetera. Almost all of the regulations are transparency related. You need to provide some information about what you're developing, what safety procedures you have in place. And then the AI Safety Institute is a part of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is explicitly, by statute, not a regulatory agency, right? Mm-hmm. So the only sort of new agency that was created in the we promise this is not going to be a regulation kind of box within the government. So that's how I think that Biden administration and therefore a second Harris administration would sort of explain why they're consistent with the Democratic Party platform. There's one interesting exception, though. And this is another area of apparently bipartisan consensus. And that has to do with regulation related to antitrust. Under the Biden administration, the Federal Trade Commission has been led by a woman named Lina Khan. And she has been very open and, written a lot of guidance about all the dangers of tech companies being too big, and that has included AI. There was an investigation, for example, into the relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI and whether that was a merger in all but name and whether that was therefore an anti-competitive, degree of practice. So the Biden administration has really stepped up antitrust investigations. Well, guess who loves antitrust investigations in the Trump orbit? Vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance, right? He has been really aggressive in thinking about, tech companies being too big, it being a source of all kinds of problems. This is one of those another weird areas where there is a little bit of a bipartisan movement. Not that there's not Republicans or Democrats who are against this antitrust movement, but in terms of who's the candidate, there has been some move in this area.
It's really interesting. Let's talk about the influences that both campaigns have and are going to have. Both of the campaigns' AI policy positions are likely to be influenced by think tanks like us, industry groups, other third parties from both sides of the aisle. Can you outline what are some of the Harris campaign's biggest influences when it comes to AI policy, and then shift to the Trump campaign's influences?
So I realize I was just talking about how the Biden administration has been focused on antitrust issues, or at least at the Federal Trade Commission level. And the Federal Trade Commission is a little bit insulated from the broader executive branch for reasons I won't get into. I do think it's fair to say that because the Biden-Harris administration has been so focused on voluntary regulations at this stage and transparency type regulations, you have a situation where Vice President Harris has developed a personal relationship with a lot of these executives and understands these teams. I think it's fair to say that the administration has a lot of engagement with the major tech companies that are leading AI development, around the world right now. As I mentioned before, reportedly it was Vice President Harris's idea, right, to have the big meeting with all the technology executives. Of course, the think tank, the policy community, the advocacy community, all of that is real and very important. I won't go into the details too much.
I think they should both listen to a very important bipartisan think tank with the acronym CSIS.
I've heard they're great. Great.
Me too.
And they have a great podcast, too.
Particularly the Wadhwani Center, I was going to say. So.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the vote of confidence. So I think the Trump campaign, in terms of AI, is probably a little bit more, I think it's safe to say, a little bit more influenced by the venture capital. So there are prominent venture capitalists who are big backers of the Biden-Harris campaign. For example, Reid Hoffman, who was the founder of LinkedIn, one of the founders of PayPal, has been a big backer of the Biden-Harris administration and now the Harris campaign. On the Republican side, one of the most important backers of Donald Trump in 2016 was a man named Peter Thiel, who coincidentally also a co-founder of PayPal. Kind of remarkable, that guy. And he was one of the early investors in Facebook and has been a really important player in Silicon Valley for a long time. In 2016, when it was pretty difficult in Silicon Valley to be a supporter of Trump, he spoke at the Republican National Convention, loudly, openly, strongly supporting Trump as a candidate. And in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Chief Technology Officer of the United States was somebody who had previously worked at Peter Thiel's venture capital firm. So the folks in that part of the venture capital community, I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration and the Trump campaign have good ties. So now you sort of think about that's I think something that we could plausibly see coming back is some of those folks. Also, Russell Vought, right, is important. We mentioned that Russell Vought is the policy director of the Republican National Committee's Platform Committee and has been since May 2024. I think another thing worth calling out is that he's involved with Project 2025, which is a Heritage Foundation effort to do two things. Number one is come up with a lot of policy proposals and sort of mature those policy proposals to the level where a White House can actually implement them. Because it's one thing to have an idea. It's another thing to have an idea that can be enacted into law. It's another thing to have an idea that can actually be part of an administration policy implementation. And so think tanks sometimes do a lot of work to mature policies to get them to that level. The other thing that Project 2025 is trying to do is to identify individuals who could staff an administration. Anytime you have a new president, especially when there's a party change, there's thousands of jobs that have to be filled with political appointees. And in the case of the Trump administration, if they pass this Schedule F reform, which would convert a lot of current civil service positions to political appointee status, or at least something more closely resembling political appointee status, there's going to be a lot of people, right, who suddenly are an empty slot in the government, and you need to find people. And a
lot of turnover.
Exactly. And Project 2025 is trying to find names who are part of the Trump orbit, known to be supporters and reliable supporters of the Trump administration, to serve in those roles. So I think the fact that Project 2025 actually has views on AI policy, potentially, we don't know this for a fact, right, but potentially authored by Russell Vaught and his supporters, it would do some really important things. So other than Project 2025, which I think it's fair to say that Russell Vaught and those would be mostly on a sort of a deregulatory mandate and things that even look like regulation, there's also a different think tank, which is called the America First Policy Institute, which is led by Larry Kudlow, Trump's former chief economic advisor. And recently there was a leaked draft in the Washington Post, and it's important to note this came out from a think tank. It's not official Trump campaign document, but it was a draft executive order for the Trump administration to enact on AI. And one of the things it called for was a Manhattan Project for defense AI. Under the Biden administration, we've seen defense AI spending go up a lot. I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration would like it to go up a lot more. One thing to note here is that there's been a movement in the Silicon Valley venture capital community to get interested in defense technology again. And for decades, right, defense technology was something that if you went to a VC firm and said, I want your investment in my defense technology firm, they would laugh at you. That's not been true in the past few years. And some of the people have been invested in by Peter Thiel's firm, right? So Palantir has been one of the most successful defense startups of the past 15 years. Anduril is another defense AI and autonomy company that we've talked about on this podcast before. That is also something that's been invested in by Peter Thiel's firm. And Mark Andreessen and his firm, Andreessen Horowitz, have also been big investors in these new defense tech startups. Mark Andreessen has publicly endorsed Trump campaign for president. So I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of enthusiasm in Republican policy circles and in the Trump campaign in particular for this sort of new AI-enabled defense technology and for massively increasing the spending there. And I think that's something that the Biden administration agrees with, even if they're frustrated that some of these companies have prominent executives who are not supporting their campaign.
Okay, let's talk some potential Harris and potential Trump administration positions on key AI policy issues. So let's start with this. What might AI safety look like under both a Harris administration and a Trump administration?
This is actually one of the areas where there's probably the biggest difference. So on the one hand, the first Trump administration embraced the word safety in the AI context. One of the principles in the Trump administration's AI executive order was that we want safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. And I just want to emphasize, the word safety means something in the AI policy community. Well, now, apparently, a lot of folks who are prominent in the Trump campaign really don't like the word safety anymore. And part of that has to deal with its perception as a synonym for censorship in the social media policy. So the Trump campaign is really not on board with AI safety certainly not as a word and potentially not as a policy. Now, whether or not that means that they would want to, for example, disband the AI Safety Institute versus rename the AI Safety Institute and perhaps, change some of its activities and directives, unclear at this stage. But the name is definitely gone, I would say. In a potential Harris administration, I think AI safety is going to continue to be a focus. And I think what they would basically say is, this is something that, is a really common analogy that's used in like the risk management community. Think about your car, and now think about how fast you would drive your car if you really did have to get from A to B, but your brakes don't work. You have no brakes. Mm-hmm. How fast are you going to drive that car when you have really slow? Right? Because you can't trust yourself to stop if you need to stop and you're already going fast. And so the point basically being is if we have stronger brakes, we can actually drive the car faster. And I think the same thing is how the Harris administration would view safety capacity in the government, right? If we have more tools in the toolbox to ensure and assess that AI technologies are safe, we'll actually adopt them faster. This is actually a pro-innovation policy, assuming we get it right.
Let's turn to this. There's a debate, of course, and we've talked about this, over whether powerful AI models should be open source. And it's really one of the most important technology policy issues of our time. So how do each campaign view the open source discussion?
So this is interesting. In this case, I think the Trump campaign has a position. And the position that they have is that they are pro-open source. It gets back to the sort of anti-big tech sentiments that are prominent in some Republican policy circles, including those that are influential in the Trump campaign. But the Biden-Harris campaign actually doesn't have a policy on open source yet. What they did is they directed the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to run a process by which they had a massive request for information. Anybody and everybody could make their argument as to why open source or open weight AI models should or should not be allowed. And they are on the hook to deliver recommendations to the president. So all that the Biden-Harris administration has committed to on this topic so far is they think it should be studied. And I kind of doubt that they're going to make any big moves on this, before the election is over. I think everybody agrees that there are unambiguous benefits to open source technology. But if you are the Biden-Harris administration, you are asking yourself, if we're trying to block, for example, the sale of AI chips to China so that they can't develop their own AI models, do we want to open source models and give them away for free, including in places like, China, where they can download them? So those are the kinds of questions that they want an answer to. And I suspect what their straw man version of their policy is, open source or open weight AI models are bad. And I just don't think that's actually their policy. I think they're sort of asking themselves, what is the right balance of risk mitigation and also harnessing the benefits of open source? And where they're going to land on that debate, we really just don't know.
And what about Trump?
Trump has not yet actually come out and said something explicit on open source, but his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, has done so. He's really voiced his support for open source AI models as a solution to what he's claiming is the risk of, quote, a partisan group of crazy people who use AI to infect every part of the information economy with left-wing bias.
Okay.
Well, the Trump administration uses colorful language.
It is campaign. Hey, look, it is campaign season.
It is campaign season. So that is the problem that open source solves, evidently. But, really, I think it, again, comes back to the venture capital community. And one of the things that they're wondering is whether, entrenched tech companies can really be competed against, given how expensive it is to train these large language AI models. And if there are open source alternatives, that might help level the playing field for more startup type companies, compared with tech incumbents. There's more reasons than just that, why the supporters of open source like it. But I thought that was worth calling out.
All right, let's turn to our favorite island nation, Taiwan. TSMC is a really important relationship for the United States, as most advanced AI chips are made by them. And our future relationship with Taiwan, there's a key to understanding the trajectory of AI policy. So how do you expect both Harris and Trump campaigns to handle the Taiwan relationship?
Yeah, I think most people listening to this podcast already know it at this point, but it's worth just restating for a moment that NVIDIA designs AI chips. Those chips are manufactured by TSMC,
right?
A
So
company.
American company designs them, Taiwan
company makes them. Yes,
right.
And so if Taiwan was to be invaded by China, it's a big question, where are these chips going to be made? How is America going to access to them? And the export controls policy to restrict the sale of AI chips to China, well, the reason why that works is that there are not Chinese companies who can do what Taiwan can when it comes to manufacturing these advanced AI chips. So Taiwan, of course, they're known as the chip Goliath around the world. But that means that they're really important in AI policy. The Biden administration has been remarkably clear, I would say, with Joe Biden in particular making statement after statement that if China invades Taiwan, that America is going to go to war to defend Taiwan. As vice president, Harris, traveled to Japan in 2022 and said stuff like, we would continue to support Taiwan's self-defense, pretty standard U.S. foreign policy consensus for many, many decades now. Biden's statements are a little bit more provocative than what Harris said. Trump, a little bit different.
So tell me about Trump.
So Trump has made some statements in interviews that are pretty critical of Taiwan and pretty critical of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So in an interview with Bloomberg just recently, he was asked whether he would defend Taiwan against China, and he didn't explicitly answer that, but he did say, quote, they did take about 100% of our chip business. So he's referring to the fact that, the founder of TSMC, the founder of TSMC was originally working at Texas Instruments in America before moving to Taiwan, and he was really important in a lot of chip manufacturing moving to Taiwan. Then on the defense issue, Trump has said, quote, Taiwan should pay us for defense. We're no different than an insurance company. Taiwan doesn't give us anything. And he's also said that if China was to, go after Taiwan, they wouldn't bombard the island, quote, because they don't want to lose all those chip plants. The question basically is Trump going to say things that makes China think that it is fair game to go invade Taiwan? If that happens, I've said this before, the global economy is in for an incredible, devastating moment because of the loss of that chip industry. AI is definitely going to be a big victim there, but they're not going to be the only victim. Taiwan is important to the chip sector for more than just that. But I think Taiwan is going to keep coming up. Whoever is the president in 2025, this issue is not going away.
Greg, you mentioned that Senator Vance has some pretty well-formed ideas about regulating AI. Can you get into that a little bit more? I'd like to have our listeners understand a little bit better.
Vance stands out as a former venture capitalist, right? How many vice presidential candidates can never say those words? And J.D. Vance can. And so he really has strong opinions on tech regulation, on AI, and I think it says a lot. Remember what we said before, people are a policy, that Trump picked him as his vice presidential candidate on tech issues. No guarantee that the Trump as president, again, would delegate to J.D. Vance the way that President Biden has to some extent delegated to Vice President Harris, but I think that's totally plausible. In a hearing just this month, July 2024, of the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, Senator Vance argued that preemptive regulation was going to entrench big tech incumbents and ensure that they're the only companies who are capable of dealing with increased compliance costs of regulation. So the quote is actually worth reading. I think it's interesting here. So here it goes. Quote, I also worry that legitimate concern is justifying some preemptive overregulation attempts that would frankly entrench the tech incumbents that we already have and make it harder for new entrants to create the innovation that's going to power the next generation of American growth. So, there, once again, I think we see that he has strong opinions on this. It comes back to, what AI means, the balance between venture capital communities and big tech communities. And that's sort of what I'm watching as we think about the next stage of the campaign.
All right, Greg, finally, I want to ask you about energy and infrastructure requirements for training AI models. They're incredibly significant, and policymakers are looking for sustainable energy policy solutions. How do you expect a Trump administration and Harris administration to approach this kind of challenge?
Yeah, so, energy regulation is not AI regulation, but energy regulation is really important for the future of AI. And the reason for that...
And AI drains an enormous amount of energy.
Oh, yes. In fact, the Trump quote on this topic, because it's a great one. So Donald Trump went on the All In podcast hosted by two venture capitalists, one of which is David Sachs. And here's Trump's quote on the issue of AI and electricity. Quote, they need electricity at levels that nobody's ever experienced before to have to be successful, to be a leader in AI. The amount of electricity they need is double what we have right now and even triple what we have right now. So what he's sort of claiming and what Republican policy circles are talking about is it takes a while to build a power plant for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons why it takes a while to build a power plant is because of a lot of regulations. And so I think what the Trump administration is signaling is that if we're going to continue to be a leader in AI, we're going to need to build a lot more power. We're going to need to build a lot more electrical generation capacity. We're going to need to build a lot more electrical transmission capacity. And what he's saying is that the Biden administration is not going to get that done. He is going to get that done. And he's sort of making an argument for why he would be able to help the United States retain its leadership in AI. It's a part of the argument that I've heard, in sort of like nerdy, wonky AI policy circles, and I was kind of amazed to hear it come out of Donald Trump's mouth. I think the fact that he's paying attention to that issue says a lot. Now, that said, Democratic policy circles are paying attention to it too, but they haven't yet taken steps to address it, and that's why the Trump campaign can criticize them on those.
So we're going to have to wait to know what the Harris campaign thinks on this issue.
I would say it's an issue where they really ought to have a policy position. What are they going to do about energy? And of course, they'll want it to be clean energy. They'll want it to be renewable energy. But they do need an answer for how they're going to make it possible to generate a lot more electricity in this country.
Well, Greg, I suspect in the days and months to come, we are going to be hearing a lot of answers to some of these questions from both candidates. And it's going to be exciting for us to watch and exciting for us to talk about. So thanks for this early primer. To be continued is all I can say.
Yeah, we'll have to have a refresh in January of 2025. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We'd also love to hear from you, so reach out to AI Policy Podcast at csis.org with your suggestions and feedback. And finally, don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for our latest research reports and events. This podcast was produced by David Lutfi, Isaac Goldson, Sadie McCullough, Teddy Foley, Sam Gonzalez, and Arena Petrick. See you next time.